All right, let's begin. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for taking the time out this evening to join us. My name is Sunny, and I'm one of the PhD students here in the Religious Studies Department at Stanford University. Whether it is your first time joining or you've participated before, we want to welcome everyone yet again to the first of 5 Ptarmigan events taking place this academic year. The Ptarmigan series showcases a slate of distinguished scholars who discuss various themes related to late ancient studies, and this evening's program is definitely no exception to that. We've budgeted exactly 1 hour for this event, and we ask that you kindly do take advantage of the Q&A button that you could find at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation. I'll return after the lecture is finished to present those questions to our speaker. Now, tonight, I am extremely excited, and we are very privileged to have with us Dr. Sean Anthony, Associate Professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at the Ohio State University. Go Buckeyes. Dr. Anthony is the recipient of various distinctions and awards for his contributions to the field of Islamic studies, and is the author of numerous publications, including his most recent book, Muhammad and the Empires of Faith, the Making of the Prophet of Islam. Today, Dr. Anthony will be speaking to us on early Islamic perceptions of the Kaaba. And with that, I will now disappear and I will pass the virtual mic on to you. Thank you again for your time this evening.
Thank you very much, Sunny. Let's go ahead and start my screen share. Hopefully it won't actually go all the way to the beginning. Okay, hopefully that's clear for everybody. Thank you for the very kind introduction and for the invitations. I'm very happy to join you guys at Stanford. Stanford's an institution that's near and dear to my heart. And so I thank you again for your hospitality. Today, I just wanted to talk about pose a relatively simple question that, because of its simplicity, could be answered in many ways. And that is simply, what is the Kaaba? But there are, of course, many ways of answering that question. What I would like to focus on is not so much the encyclopedist answer, where we go through and say, well, the Kaaba is the cuboid structure at the center of Mecca. It has many different names besides the Kaaba. Kaaba itself meaning cube, but it's also called Baytullah. It's also, that is the house of God. We could say things like, it is the, it is the Qibla, or is the direction of prayer that all Muslims worldwide face when they pray. And we can also talk about its role in the pilgrimage rituals, whether we're talking about the major pilgrims, the Hajj, or the Umrah, the minor pilgrimage. And we can talk about many of the ways in which it serves as the focal point of the rituals of the Hajj itself. But what I would like to do, rather than go through a list like that, is rather try to answer or try to give you some sense of how some of our earliest sources to mention the Kaaba, and by earliest, I mostly mean sources that fall within the first 200 years of the rise of Islam, but mostly this falls somewhere between the year 600 and the year 800. What are these early sources focus on? What do they talk about? And how do looking at these sources, both Muslim and non-Muslim, tell us about how they perceive the Kaaba, how they tried to kind of understand it? Now, first and foremost, it is worth thinking about the Kaaba in and of itself. The Kaaba sits in the deepest part of a valley called Mecca. It's often given to flooding. It does have a source of water, famously the well Zamzam, but it's a rather modest and unassuming building, at least for most of its history. Nowadays, if you go to Mecca, it will look much less modest than it used to, but its simplicity and its kind of modest structure, it's a rather simple semi-rectangular structure, not quite a perfect square, not quite a perfect rectangle either, sits in the midst of the valley, and it's the simplicity of its structure often is seen to be kind of a marker, or at least a sign of the simplicity of Islamic faith in one single God and its rituals, as humankind kind of serving God as his servants and equal before him. In any case, the history of the Kaaba, however, is anything but simple. We both have the structure itself, but also we have a pretty vast corpus of historical and materials that relate to sacred history. The Kaaba is connected most famously with Abraham, who we'll talk most about today. But often the Kaaba is associated with the first human beings too, Adam and Eve. Sometimes, more surprisingly to some people, the Kaaba is associated in many Muslim narratives, at least since Ferdowsi, Shahnameh, Ferdowsi dies in 1025, with even a visitation by the Macedonian conqueror Alexander the Great. Has a very interesting role in afterlife in Islamic literature, both in Arabic and Persian literature. In more modern times, one of the things that I think distinguishes the Kaaba, interestingly enough, is that it has its own emoji. There's not a lot of holy sites that have their own emoji. I think if we count the Statue of Liberty as a holy site, I don't think the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has its own holy site or anything like that. No Wailing Wall emoji or anything like that. But the Kaaba, surprisingly enough, has its own kind of emoji. The Kaaba, as it's situated too, is rather interesting structurally in terms of its location and place. There's all sorts of fascinating things that we can learn from looking at just how it was built. It is not built directly on a north, south, east-west axis, but rather it's meant to face, well, an easterly direction that matches the summer sunrise, and then its southerly direction matches the rising of Canopus, one of the second brightest stars in the sky. In its southeast corner, we have the famous Black Stone, or at least what remains of it today. It was once a group tried to destroy it in order to bring about the apocalypse. We won't be talking about them today, but it only survives in fragments today, even though you can still see those fragments set in the side of the Kaaba. In any case, it is sort of the you might be able to say it's the pole star for Islamic religiosity, and Islam is religion itself. That's one of the reasons why it became an icon of early Muslim religiosity at an early date. So let's begin first, though, with the first answer to our question of what the Kaaba is. I'm going to say the first question to the answer of what the Kaaba is, well, what we find in the Quran. It's a sacred place of worship. Yeah.
Sean, I'm sorry. Do you have your slides going? We only see slide 13.
So you're not seeing my actual slides?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me do it again. Sorry. Let me do a new share. Does that work?
There we go. Yeah.
Are they switching now?
Yeah. Excellent.
All right. Thanks. Okay. All right. That makes sense. Okay. So the first answer that we have is a sacred place of worship founded by Abraham. We don't get that in the earliest parts of the Quran. One of the earliest parts of the Quran, early Meccan surah, whose meaning is not necessarily entirely clear, at least not all of the words, is the 106th surah. Most of the earliest surahs or chapters of the Quran are very short. And one of the earliest is 106. As you can see, it's also one of the shortest. Not the shortest, but it's definitely one of the shortest. And it has a series of interesting statements. It says, for the safety of Quraysh. This is the only time that the name Quraysh appears. The name Quraysh is the name of the tribe, and that is the caretaker and the overseer of Mecca. It's the name of the tribe from which the Prophet Muhammad himself comes from, and from which most of his early followers come from. And eventually it will be the name of the tribe that all of the caliphs, at least most of the caliphs up until the end of the Abbasids, will descend. So the Quraysh are kind of massively important. They're kind of at the tip top of the mountain of the early believers, and at their found at the beginning as well. In any case, for the safety of Quraysh, Ilaf, we don't really know what Ilaf means, but let's pretend we know and say that it's safety. Their safety to journey in winter and summer. Let them worship the Lord of this house, who provides them provisions against hunger and security from fear. It's a rather simple composition. It doesn't have in rhyme like most of the other surahs do in the Quran. But the thing that I want to kind of focus on is we have a mention of a people, and that people have a special relationship with a house. and this house has a lord, and the lord of the house demands or calls them to worship him at that house. And in return, they have safety or some sort of kind of binding journey that they take both winter and summer. Usually this is interpreted as a winter and summer trade journey in order to conduct business and to obtain livelihoods and things like that. In Yemen for one season, to the south and to the north, in Syria and Palestine in the other season. And in exchange for their worship, this Lord of this house provides them with provisions. They provide them with provisions of food. Mecca is not a place where one can do any sort of intensive agriculture. One can raise some herds of ruminant animals on like the harsh brush that's on the outskirts of the city, but in general, you cannot farm there. And also the other thing that's mentioned is the city is safe. That is, it's given security from fear. This is actually a very important idea. I think it's a key theme about Mecca and the sacred enclave of Mecca that runs throughout the entirety of the Quran. And that is, this is a special city that God has made safe over time and that he's taken care of for quite a long time. Let's make sure that our most explicit connection of the house over not to contemporary history or the contemporaries of the Quran comes in the second chapter of the Quran called Surah Al-Baqarah, or the cow. And in this we have one of the most kind of extraordinary passages that narrate the origin of both the people who live in Mecca and also their sanctuary that defines its existence, or at least gives rise to its existence. And what this passage does that I think is interesting and worth noting is that it sort of puts the sanctuary in Mecca into biblical history. It writes it into the history of biblical figures, and it writes it into kind of the scriptural cosmos of the late ancient world, which is mostly to this point seen to be the exclusive preserve of Christians and Jews, arguably also people like Mandeans and Manichaeans as well, but mostly Christians and Jews. In any case, let's read it. It has a lot of interesting material. So starting with verse 124, it says, when the Lord tested Abraham with certain commandments and he fulfilled him, he said, I shall make you a leader of the people, that is, of humanity. So this is God talking to Abraham. Then Abraham replies, and what of my progeny, that is, those who descend from me? And he said, my covenant does not hold for the wicked. So this is a very kind of short reference to this kind of covenantal relationship that God enters into with Abraham, with his progeny, but it's a covenant for the righteous, not for the wicked, only the righteous among his progeny. And then God continues speaking in the majestic plural. He says, we made the house a haunt and secure for the people. Again, we have this return to the theme of security. And they made the spot where Abraham stood a place of prayer. And we charged Abraham, and then now we have mention of Abraham's son Ishmael, supposedly the forefather of the Arabs, according to Jews and Christians, the late ancient world. Purify my house, again, the bait that we saw in Quraysh, for those who circle it, and circle it, that is in reverence, who abide there and who prostrate themselves in worship. And Abraham said, my Lord, make this a secure settlement and provision it with produce. And provision with produce its inhabitants who believe in God in the last day. So here again, we return to this very key theme that we saw in Surah Quraysh, and that is the previous very short surah. We have this idea of the settlement being secure, thanks to the prayer of Abraham, here made explicit. Then also we have this idea of God providing provisions for the city, again, thanks to the prayer of Abraham. But here it's explicitly conditional. It's for those of Abraham's progeny who believe in God, number one, and two, believe in the last day. That is, at the end of time, we shall all be held accountable for our deeds, whether for good or for ill. And if we're good, we go on to eternal rewards. And if we're bad, we go to HE double hockey sticks. Anyway, he said, and whosoever disbelieves, this is God speaking, I shall grant him enjoyment for a short while, and then subject him to the torment of the inferno. And as Abraham raised the foundations of the house, then we have the next part of the story. And Ishmael too. So this is something that both Abraham and Ishmael do. Our Lord, may you accept this from us. You hear and know all. So this here portrays already Abraham and Ishmael working together to build the house. So ultimately, according to this passage from the Quran, it is Abraham and Ishmael who built the house. They're ultimately the people who originated it and who built it and who erected it. And then they pray for those, for the work to be accepted. But then their prayer continues and says something interesting in the 128th verse. They say, our Lord, make us devoted to you and make our progeny a nation devoted to you. So this, again, we have returned to this word progeny, this voriya, that is those people that are genealogically descended from us, and then make them an ummah, a nation. Ummah in Arabic is the exact same word as biblical Hebrew goy. You might have heard the people of Israel called a great nation, a goy gadol. This is the Arabic equivalent, ummah. And if we look at the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible done by Jews at this time, particularly in Palestine, the cognate of the Arabic ummah in Aramaic is exactly what they use in order to translate the word goy. So ummah muslimatan laka, so an ummah that's devoted to you. And then they pray, show us the rites we ought to perform and accept our repentance, for you are ever relenting and merciful. So we have, and now again, we have mention of a progeny, a nation that's meant to be devoted to God. And then we also have subsequent mention of rites that they have to perform at the house. So it's not merely a structure that's meant for gathering or for shelter, but it's also a structure that has rites of worship associated with it. And then finally, they have final prayer, our Lord, and send to them a messenger from amongst them who shall recite to them your signs and teach them scripture and wisdom and purifying them, for you are almighty and wise. So this is kind of the real clincher, is because it has, now they have prayer that there shall come from the Suriyah of Abraham and Ishmael a messenger, and that messenger shall recite signs. The signs, this is the word for the verses and the parts of the Quran, and they will teach them scripture, and they'll teach them wisdom, and they will purify them of what? In larger context, we learn this means purify them from adultery and from polytheism, and then the declaration, of course, that God is almighty and wise. This is absolutely a pivotal verse for understanding kind of the role of both Mecca and the Kaaba and the rites associated with the Kaaba, and the place of the Prophet Muhammad's people in sort of the understanding and the preaching of the Quran. It portrays them both as descendants of Abraham and Ishmael together. It portrays them as a community that through the descent of Ishmael has inherited a sanctuary that was founded, a house that was founded by both their ancestors, Abraham and Ishmael. And it also talks about a series of rites that are associated with this house and that are basically founded by Abraham and Ishmael. And then also, finally, we have this ending, this expectation where the Prophet Muhammad is prayed for, at least that is what's implied. And in essence, the Prophet Muhammad and his movement and the revelation of the Quran, the scripture to him, is seen to be a fulfillment, as is kind of those of his nation that follow him, a fulfillment of this prayer of Abraham. Of course, one of the things you may have noticed is that we don't have a mention of the Kaaba itself by that name in any of these verses. We actually have only 2 mentions of the word Kaaba in the Quran, and they both appear in the exact same surah. They both appear in Surah Ma'idah. Let's see. And it appears right here on this page. This is one of the earliest copies of the Quran that we have. It's written in a version of Hijazi script. It's alifs. If you know anything about Arabic, you can see its alifs have feet, that as they kind of have this bottom, like, I don't know what you call it, a curve that marks it off as an early script. But if we look at the key verse, that I want to focus on, we have kind of this very explicit statement of what the Kaaba is and how it is to be understood. And basically in this verse, it says, God ordained the Kaaba. And then the Kaaba is what? It's called al-Bayt al-Haram, to be a pillar or guide, a symbol. And this word qiyam is kind of difficult to translate, for humanity and the sacred month, the sacrificial animals and their garlands, all of this. So we have mention of the Kaaba, and we have it clarified as being the sacred house, its role for all humanity, its association with an understanding of time that has kind of sacred months set apart. And then also we have mention of very specific rites, like the sacrifice of animals that are garland. All this is very important stuff. Know that God has knowledge of all that is in the heavens and the earth, and that he is fully aware of all of these things. And if you want to see probably one of the earliest occurrences, at least one of the earliest extant occurrences of the word Kaaba in Arabic, hopefully you can see this, hopefully our slides are working, you can see it right here. Well, really it continues. This is the beginning of the word alif here. It continues on this line. So that's one of our kind of earliest attestations to the word Kaaba in Arabic. Okay. So in sum, those are two kind of just selections of what we have in the Quran that's mentioned about the Kaaba and things like that. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a summary of how the Quran tends to portray, at least one of the ways in which the Quran portrays both Mecca, the sanctuary, and the Kaaba, which is its centerpiece. Number one, of course, we have this issue of the pilgrimage. A pilgrimage appears in the Quran, and one of the things that we note about pilgrimage is that in the Quran is that it's only mentioned with associations with Mecca, right? It emphasizes the unmitigated importance of the rites of the Meccan cult, and especially prayer, especially circumambulation, that is walking around in a circle, and also the ritual slaughter of animals and their garlandry. And also we have the associations of these rituals with sacred month. In the later parts of the Quran, what we call the Medinan Quran, it's the part of the Quran that was given or preached by the Prophet Muhammad between the year 622 and 632. We also see that the Meccan cult is not merely for Abraham's descendants, as we often see in the earlier passages, and his progeny, but also we have a broader sense, like we have in this verse here from Ma'idah, that it's for all people, it's for Anas, it's for mankind. When viewed overall, I think these are the following themes that we see in the Quran when we think about Mecca and also the Kaaba. Number one, Mecca and the Kaaba are usually portrayed as the first house dedicated to the Abrahamic cult of primordial monotheistic worship. It's called, Mecca is itself called the mother of the cities, Qurra, and thus as the first house, it implies that it's even before places like Mount Moriah, Zion, Jerusalem, Hebron, any place that you might want to mention. This creates somewhat a bit of confusion, I think, later on and subsequent exegesis, because the Quran calls the Kaaba the first place, or Mecca the first place that was the first house that was founded for humanity to worship at. You have a very strong exegetical theme that associates the Kaaba and Mecca as being founded by Adam rather than by Abraham. This becomes the standard view. This is not a Quranic view. We do have some early dissenting views. One of the more interesting ones comes from Ali ibn Abi Talib, who is the father-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, married his sole surviving daughter, who's also the father of his sole surviving grandchildren. He says that no, that according to this tradition attributed to Ali, the prophet Abraham and the prophets Abraham and Ishmael, they were indeed the ones who first founded the Kaaba. It was not Adam, but rather this was the first house of God that was made to be Mubarak, which is the key, which means blessed, which is one of the key words in the verse. So there were many people that had many places of worship for God, but this was kind of the most important one, and it preceded the founding of Jerusalem, and thus should be more seen as more important than at least Jerusalem. In any case, so the key idea here is that the Quran not only wants to emphasize the importance of Mecca, but also its primacy beyond any of its kind of biblical competition, right? The other thing is that Mecca and the Kaaba is not merely the birthplace, but it's also the axis, the center, the ritual center of the religion of Abraham and the cultic community bequeathed to Abraham's progeny, whom Abraham charged with maintaining the house, keeping it pure, that is pure, keeping it pure by eschewing idolatry and by upholding the prayers and by performing the rites of pilgrimage. Even when we get to the Medinan period, after the Prophet Muhammad and his followers kind of flee Mecca, they could have said, we don't need this place anymore. They persecuted us and they treated us harshly, etc. But that's not what they do. It seems like by the time we get to the Medinan period, we even see an increased importance of Mecca and the Kaaba and its rites, not a decrease. And lastly, Mecca is and the Kaaba itself, as the house founded by Abraham and Ishmael, is the epicenter of the Quran's claim for the people of the Prophet Muhammad to be descended from Ishmael and to be descended from Abraham. This descent is something that seemed to be the inheritance of the Prophet Muhammad's people and his early followers. It is called one verse, Mulk Alim, that is a majestic patrimony that they received from Abraham as a member of his family. Ishmael, in this understanding, is an equal heir to the promise of Abraham alongside Isaac and his progeny, the Jews. Perhaps even Ishmael has a special role to play in this understanding. With the subsequent triumphs of the community, Mecca's centrality and the centrality of the Kaaba to its ritual only becomes stronger, right? And it becomes an icon of kind of early Islamic identity from a very early date. How early can we say? Well, this is debatable. So I'm not going to pretend I'm going to give you a consensus view, but I'm going to give you my view. I think that we have a pretty good sense that the Kaaba in Mecca is of central importance to the early conquerors from very early on. So what happens, of course, after the already this is happening prior to his death in 632. Before his death, he essentially unites politically the Arabian Peninsula and receives at least the outward political capitulation and recognition of his authority as a prophet from most of the major Arabian tribes. After his death in 632, obviously we have these massive conquests that unite the Eurasian axis that you see here: Iranian Plateau, Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, Sinai, Egypt. It's kind of this whole geography is united under the early Islamic conquest. We don't have a lot of sources from the contemporaries that experienced these conquests. And we definitely do get a sense that those that did experience the conquerors' new hegemony took a while to understand what had happened and who these people are and things like that. They tend to speak about them mostly using a kind of a repertoire of stereotypes about the inhabitants, and particularly the nomadic inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula. However, they do, at least the most intrepid of them, do have some pretty interesting observations from a pretty early date nonetheless. And the one that I want to focus on right now comes from an area called Khuzestan. We don't know who wrote it. It's an anonymous author. His entire chronicle is not preserved, but he himself is a contemporary of the conquest. He's probably a younger contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad. We don't know this 100% certain, but his life probably did overlap with the Prophet Muhammad even just a little bit. Definitely overlapped a lot with the companions. And he is more or less curious about who these people are to a very interesting degree, and writing probably around the 670s, when most of the major victories over the Persian Empire and the Romans had already taken place. He writes as follows. He writes this in Syriac. He says, the victory of the Ishmaelites who overcame and subjugated these two kingdoms, which he means Rome and Persia, was from God. That is, this is an inexorable event. This was a judgment from God. Indeed, the victory is his, ultimately. But God has not yet handed Constantinople over to them. And concerning the thingy, the Qubto of Abraham, we cannot find out what it is except for this. So it's a very interesting statement. Before I go on and read the rest, I did want to make a couple of statements. So with him writing this down, we already have the sense that he heard about something and he doesn't know what it is. He's not entirely familiar with it, but he knows that it's important. And he writes down the name of it in Syriac. If we just read it straightforward as a Syriac, it would be the word for a dome, but also has another meaning, a meaning that has a common cognate in Arabic, which I would choose to translate it as, and that is a qubba. A qubba is like a type of tent, or I would say a tabernacle. And so I think he is talking about a tabernacle of Abraham, and I think he's more or less relying upon his biblical knowledge about the Abrahamic accounts in order to kind of draw a parallel here. But the important thing is that he hears that these conquerors that he calls the Ishmaelites, the descendants of Ishmael, they have an important sanctuary. And this sanctuary is named after Abraham. It's called the sanctuary of Abraham, or the tabernacle of Abraham, or if you prefer, the dome of Abraham. This word kupto might actually be even just a Syriac speaker's attempt to write out the word Kaaba, but he fails to do so correctly. He mishears it or something. We have a later Syriac author by the name of Jacob of Edessa, who actually does write down the word Kaaba, and he transliterates it. That is, he gets the letters perfectly right when he's writing it in Syriac. But this early author does not, if he is trying to render Kaaba. Anyway, he never heard of it, and that doesn't make him unique. I should note. Prior to the rise of Islam, despite it's important to the kind of Muslim kind of sacred memory and sacred history, we have no mention by any source that's extant or that survives that predates the Islamic period that mentions either the existence of Mecca or let alone anything called the Kaaba, or for that matter, its association with Abraham. We do have very old sources that associate the inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula, the Sinai, Eastern Egypt, with Abraham and with Ishmael and Midianites and all sorts of other biblical figures. But we have absolutely no pre-Islamic mention that's unambiguous, at least, of the Kaaba whatsoever. We have one potential second century mention of Mecca from Ptolemy, but that's dubious. They really have no mention of it. As far as we know, the Kaaba doesn't appear, nor does Mecca in any of the biblical accounts, or any of the kind of extra biblical accounts that appears in the kind of scriptural universe of the late ancient world. And so he's trying to get a foothold and understand what this is. And this is what he gathers. This is what he thinks he's able to find out. He says, because the blessed Abraham had become rich in property and also wanted to be far from the Canaanites' envy, the Canaanites, of course, the inhabitants of Palestine, what becomes later Israel, Judah, etc., he chose to dwell in the vast and distant parts of the desert. So it seems like he knows it's in the desert, and it's in a very distant part of the desert. Because of the place's memory had also been preserved by the clan's descendants, it took its current name for what it had been. It is not new for the Arabs to worship there. So already we have this idea that Arabs worship there, and it's supposedly a very old place, even by the time that the conquest occurred. And the last key statement, he says, rather, from the beginning long ago, they have so honored the forefather of their people, the forefather being Abraham. What's really striking to me about this passage, besides the fact that it's very early, and that it's written by a contemporary of the conquest, and it's written before anyone had set kind of pen to paper to record a non-Quranic Arabic version of the communal memory or history. It precedes the birth hour of Arabic historiography, properly speaking, is how much seems to be in accord with the themes that we've talked about before that we find in the Quran. That is the idea that's associated with Abraham, that Abraham is the one who found it, and that their connection to it is basically due to the fact that they are descended from Abraham. And when they worship there, they do so in honor of a figure that they regard as the genealogical forefather of their people. Okay. Another kind of quick source I would like to point out before moving out to our second answer to what is the Kaaba is the importance from a pretty early date for the in the ideology of the conquest elite. This happens in a dynasty called the Umayyads, who ruled until 750, of the importance of both Jerusalem as a holy site and Mecca together. And this is, I think, very nicely summed up in a famous line from one of the greatest poets of the early Islamic period, a man by the name of Faraz, who died in 732. And he boasts of the Arabs of the time. He's boasting as an Arab, and he's boasting of kind of their status in the world, their newfound post-conquest status. And he says as follows. He says, وَبَيْتَانِ بَيْتُ اللَّهِ نَحْنُ وَلَاتُهُ وَبَيْتٌ بِعَالَ إِلِيَاءَ وَشَرَّهُ, which basically translates to, two houses are ours, the house of God, this would be the Kaaba, we are its guardians, and a house upon the uppermost height of Elia. Elia being Elia Capitolina, this is the Roman name given to Jerusalem. And he's referring, of course, to the newly constructed Dome of the Rock that sat at the highest point in Jerusalem, at the Temple Esplanade, with this kind of beautiful dome and this kind of gorgeous octagonal architecture. They saw themselves as possessing and being the guardians now, not just of, and the inheritors, not just of one house, Abraham's original house in Mecca, but also of the other house of God, that of Jerusalem, founded later as well. Okay, second answer to the question that we get. What was the Kaaba? This one's a bit more curious. We're not going to so much rely upon this one, on the Quran for this one, but because the answer comes later. So to answer the question, what is the Kaaba? Many answered a house of idols, or at least if they were from the believing side of the equation, a former house of idols. Where the idea of the Kaaba as one day, or having been at any time in its history, a house of idols, is not one that one finds in the Quran. One finds polemic against idols, idolatry. One finds polemics against polytheism. One finds polemics against religious rites that are seen to be contrary to the rights that are given by the patriarch Abraham to the Meccans and the Quraysh and the descendants of Ishmael. But you do not find any mention of the Kaaba being a house of idols in the Quran. This is a product of later Arabic historiography, but it appears, at least from a polemical perspective, earliest, that doesn't mean necessarily it was first believed by them, but it appears earliest in the writings of Christian polemicists writing against Islam. And the first of them to write this is probably one of the most famous of them, as the last of the church fathers, like so-called, a man by the name of John Damascene, who died somewhere around 750. We don't really know his exact death date. John Damascene is an extremely interesting figure, massively important intellectual for late Roman Christianity. He lived the entirety of his life under the early Islamic Empire, ironically, wrote almost everything entirely in Greek. And he's involved in a number of theological controversies, including the iconoclast controversies. We can go on and on about this. One of the things that's fascinating about him is his family history. John Damascene actually descended from a Christian family, perhaps an Arab Christian family, that lived in Damascus prior to the Islamic conquest, and then after the Islamic conquest, availed their services as scribes and as imperial secretaries to the earliest caliphs, in particular the Umayyad dynasty that ruled until 750. So, as we see portrayed, this is the two pictures that you see portrayed here, or one of the earliest manuscripts of any of John Damascene's works that survives, and oftentimes it portrays or draws pictures of John Damascene as sitting at a scribe's table and holding kind of a scribe's pen in hand. He's seen himself to be a scribe and descended from a family of scribes. His grandfather and his father were not just mere scribes and the bureaucracy of the early caliphate. But they are also boon companions of the caliphs. They were the personal scribes of the Umayyad house. They were kind of the highest ranking scribes and very close companions to many of the caliphs, and they're one of their most trusted confidants. John does not take that life. He does not work in the imperial sector, or he doesn't join as a secretary, but rather he takes the life of a monk. We're not sure where he started his monasticism. Some say Marsaba in Palestine, but really we don't know for sure. But he very famously writes a chapter, one of his most famous treatises, The Fountain of Knowledge, on heresies. And the last of the heresies that he dedicates himself to is what he calls the heresy of the Ishmaelites. It's a very rich testimony, if not without its problems, to many of the earliest beliefs of Muslims. He probably spoke Arabic in addition to speaking Greek, even though he writes only in Greek. At least he knows very well the conquerors for whom his family worked. And he writes one of our most curious and interesting polemical portrayals of the Kaaba in Mecca. In essence, his version of the Kaaba is not a good place, let's say. And one of the things that we have to understand when we read his passage is that he's writing in the context of iconoclasm. Iconoclasm probably first starts in the Islamic world. And probably that's where we see it happening under the Umayyad Caliphate in the 720s. And then we have the first iconoclastic movement that happens under Leo in Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire. And here we get a sense that the Ishmaelites are accusing Christians of being idolaters. And they're using things like icons and crosses and things that are revered like that in order to say that they're idolaters. And this is how John recommends to respond. He says, the Ishmaelites also are famous as being idolaters because we venerate the cross, which they despise. And we respond to them, how is it that you rub yourselves against the stone by your Kabathan, which is a weird way of writing Kaaba, probably means Kaaba, and it probably is referring to the black stone that's at the southeast corner of the Kaaba. And you express your adoration to the stone by kissing it. So this is his comeback. And then he creates an odd kind of political claim that seems to show some knowledge of Arab custom and Arab history, but through a distorting lens, it seems. He goes on. This then is that which they call the stone is the head of Aphrodite, whom they used to venerate and whom they called Heber, and whom those who can understand it exactly can see even now traces of an engraving that is on the stone. So what he accuses them of being, that is the Muslims, is he accuses them of actually worshiping in a place of idolatry, right? And actually worshiping a stone that used to be the head of an idol dedicated to Aphrodite, right? And here's referring to probably Al-Uzza, which is Arabic for Venus, and things like that, who indeed Arabs were famous for worshiping, not just in Arabic historiography, but also in the stories about the monks of Palestine and Egypt and things like that. We find lots of mentions of Ishmaelites worshiping Al-Uzza. And the odd thing they say is that she is called Heber, which is a strange claim until you kind of think that what he's probably referring to is the Muslim proclamation in Arabic, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar is God is great, or literally God is greater than anything, that is. And he's probably saying, and if you know enough Arabic, you know that you could kind of play with it. You could say, instead of saying God is great, Allahu Akbar, you could say God is Akbar or Kabir. So he's probably trying to say that when they say Allahu Akbar, this Akbar is actually the name of a god, not an adjective that they're using to describe God. Supposedly, the Emperor Akbar would play with this idea too later on when he founded his own religion. I don't know if we can trust this historical account, but in any case, this is a very common polemic, this idea of the Ishmaelites and Muslims as crypto-idolaters. We find many, many attestations of it. One of the earliest actually appears on the pen of the patriarch Germanos. Whether or not he's writing this earlier or John is writing this earlier, it's not really too clear. But we can see, for example, the patriarch of Constantinople writing to a man named Thomas of Claudiopolis and chiding him for his embrace of iconoclastic ideology. He uses the Saracens or the Arabs or the Muslims as kind of a counterexample. He says, since they also seem to be among those who urge these charges of idolatry against us, that is us Orthodox Christians who revere icons, the iconophiles, Germanos continues saying, it will be quite enough for their shame and confusion to allege against them their invocation, which even to this day they make in the wilderness, that is into the desert, to a lifeless stone. He's referring again to the black stone at the corner of the Kaaba, namely that is which is called Khobar. Again, playing as this Allahu Akbar thing. And the rest of their vain conversation was seen from tradition from their fathers, as for instance, the ludicrous mysteries of their solemn festivals. Okay, that's for the polemic. What about early Arabic historiography and the early Muslim historical memory from outside the Quran of what the Kaaba was and where it comes from? One of the most interesting stories and one of the earliest stories about the Prophet Muhammad actually tells of the Kaaba's destruction. Depending on the version that you read, the Kaaba is either destroyed by a flood. Again, the valley of Mecca is quite often flooded. So often flooded, we even find in legal manuals of fiqh about whether or not one can, when Mecca is flooded, whether or not one can walk around it, whether or not one can actually swim around it, and it counts as worship. And the interesting answer that they give is, yes, you can swim around the Kaaba if it's flooded, and it does count as an act of worship. In any case, the Kaaba was destroyed early on in the Prophet Muhammad's life. Usually it's said when he's around 15, but it depends upon who's writing the account. And as the story goes, it's rebuilt. And famously, it's the Prophet Muhammad who has the honor of placing the black stone as in its current resting place at the southeast corner of the Kaaba. The story, however, is really quite fascinating in terms of who built it and how it was designed, and then also what happened to the Kaaba after its construction. So this Kaaba that was constructed early on in the Prophet Muhammad's life becomes, according to this tradition, really a house of idols. But the Prophet Muhammad sees this house as having actually been founded by Abraham for monotheistic worship, not for idolatrous worship, and very much sees his mission as the prophet and the messenger of God, and also that it is his community to restore this house to the right form of worship. In any case, the early story about its construction of the new Kaaba from Muhammad's lifetime is said to have been constructed by a guy by the name of Bakum al-Rumi. It's an interesting name in Arabic. It's not an Arab name. It's probably Pachomius. Pachomius the Roman. He's from Roman territories. Other accounts call him Egyptian. And as the story goes, when the Kaaba was destroyed or when it burned down early in Muhammad's life, there was a shipwreck from a sailor that was trading between the Roman Empire and Ethiopia to the south, and he crashed on the shore near Jeddah, nearby where Mecca is, the closest port to Mecca. And the Quraysh decided to use the wood of the wreckage in order to build the Kaaba. This kind of imagery is exceedingly rich. If you want to read it as an allegory, right? From the wreckage of the Roman Empire is built, the central beating heart of this new religion and all that stuff. In any case, as the story goes, the guy that had crashed and whose timber remained, he actually himself was also a carpenter. Right? And so they asked this guy, Pakum or Pachomius, whichever version of his name you prefer, to build it. And the Quraysh, and he says, he basically asked the Quraysh, he says, do you want the roof of the Kaaba to be pitched or flat? And the Quraysh answer him. He says, rather build it up the house of our Lord flat. So build it flat like it is today. And then he continued and he built it flat. And he put in 6 columns, 2 rows, and each row were 3 columns, and so on and so forth. And when he got to the end part of the construction of the Kaaba, supposedly he put on the columns inside the Kaaba pictures of the prophets, Anbiya, pictures of trees, pictures of angels. And there was even a picture of the prophet Muhammad, Abraham, with divining arrows, and a picture of Jesus, the son of Mary, and his mother, and a picture of the angels upon them peace, all of them. And then what happens is, the day of conquest, basically, when the prophet Muhammad finally takes control of the Kaaba, it's this version of the Kaaba with all the pictures of prophets and angels and of Jesus and Mary that he inherits. And it's that one that he decides to get rid of its idols. Most of the pictures from the inside, he erased, he took out. But it's said that supposedly the picture of Mary and Jesus that was on the inside of the Kaaba, he let remain. The story says that he put his hand or 2 of his hands over the picture of Mary and Jesus was seated on her lap. Most of these stories. So this is not the picture, of course, that was in the Kaaba. This is a picture that is a contemporary of the construction of the Kaaba from the Red Monastery in Sohag, Egypt. But he did not want it to be destroyed. And the picture supposedly remained there for many, many years. Later Meccan scholars, some of our first whose writings or teachings survive, like Atta ibn Abi Rabah, who died in 732, and also a slightly younger contemporary, Amr ibn Dinar, who died in 744, say that they saw it with their own eyes. They saw the picture, and it remained until 683, in which a troubled early history of the Kaaba began. 683 was the first time that the Kaaba was severely damaged in a fire and a siege, and it was subsequently rebuilt the following year, and then it would be destroyed again in 693, again by a fire and mangonels and a siege of the city. And is the form that it was rebuilt in 693 that more or less survives to well into the medieval period, at least up until the Ottoman era. And I'm going to leave you with one inscription, one of our earliest inscriptions. And our earliest inscription was only relatively recently discovered. It was discovered by a Saudi scholar by the name of Nasr al-Hanafi, who recently passed away. It was discovered in the Hijaz, east of Mecca, between Mecca and Ta'if, right? And it's pretty extraordinary, both in terms of its content, because it's very long, and because it's dated, and because of its mention of a direct mention of Mecca. I want to give you kind of the translation, and then I'll leave you with that. It's written by a guy named Ar-Rayyan ibn Abdullah, and he says as follows: Ar-Rayyan ibn Abdullah testifies that there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. And it suffices whosoever passes by to also testify to that. May God show to Al-Rayyan mercy and forgive him. I ask him for guidance to the path of paradise, and I ask him to be martyred in his path. Amen. He wrote this writing in the year the sacred mosque at Masjid al-Haram was built, that is built by Abd al-Malik, in the year 78, 697, 698 AD. All right. Anyway, so those are a few ways to answer what is the Kaaba in the early Islamic period. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
All right. Wow. Just so insightful. Thank you. You can't hear it, but in the Zoomiverse out there, there's a thunderous applause for this discussion. Thank you so much for this. We have a few minutes to answer some questions. We had a few people ask along the same lines. If you could just talk for a few minutes on the Qibla and how for early Muslim communities it was facing towards Jerusalem. What do we know about that transition to Mecca or to the Kaaba?
Yeah. So it's only mentioned once, and it's mentioned actually in the same surah, that's Surah Baqarah, the second surah, that has a long story about Abraham and Ishmael building the house. So what's unclear about the stories and the traditions is where they were. So, okay, let me back up. So the story goes like this. Well, the Prophet Muhammad, during the Meccan period of his preaching and his early followers, before they undertook the Hijrah in 622, when they prayed, they faced towards Jerusalem, which was to the north, right? And then when they go on Hijrah and they go from Mecca to Medina, the Qibla, or the direction of prayer, changes. And so instead of facing north, they have to go south. One of the questions that is often asked is, when they were in Mecca, okay, they prayed north, but were they praying south of the Kaaba, or were they praying north of the Kaaba? So theoretically, were one to pray north towards Jerusalem, you could basically, pardon the expression, kill two birds with one stone, right? You could pray towards Mecca, and you could pray towards Jerusalem simultaneously. That would not create a problem. Once you go to Medina, you have to make a choice, right? Because now you are located north of the city of Mecca, right? So that's one way to answer that. The other way of answering that, another way that people have framed this, is they have thought that the importance of Mecca to kind of the cultic life of the early Muslims only becomes important after they leave. That's another theory that's often put out there. I don't find that so convincing, because I think that there are a lot of verses that show that Mecca is important already, but it's definitely something that's up there and not kind of 100% entirely clear. But I will say that you do find that this is the solution. The first solution that I gave you is a solution that was arrived at for Jerusalem itself. So what do I mean by that? So if you look at Jerusalem, where the Dome of the Rock is located, the Temple Esplanade, that big square, it's called a Haram. The southern part of the Temple Esplanade, the Haram al-Sharif, is where the mosque is located and where the Qibla is located. And the dome is north of the Qibla. And so when one prays in Jerusalem, if you're praying at Aqsa Mosque, right, you don't simultaneously pray to the dome and to Mecca. So Mecca is given kind of primacy.
Excellent. Okay, I think we can fit one more question in. You mentioned earlier that the idea of ridding the Kaaba of idols came post Quran. So where did this idea of the 365 idols, or 360, some would say, where does this originate from?
So most of this comes from later historiography. The most famous book about this, but it's not the only book about this, is a book called Kitab al-Asnam, or the Book of Idols, by Ibn al-Kalbi. It's a very interesting book. It has what is ostensibly a collection of the folklore about the polytheistic era of the pre-Islamic Arabian Peninsula and in the Arabian tribes, which tribes worshiped which god, which tribes had which sanctuary where, all sorts of other things like that. Its reliability as a historical source is taken by some historians then more or less as an indispensable document, and it's viewed by others as mostly folklore. To give you a quick summation of my opinion, if you look at Ibn al-Kalbi's book and you go through the names of the gods that he mentions in the entirety of the book, most of those gods are attested in the epigraphic record. So what Al-Uzza, Allat, Manat, we have these attested in pre-Islamic inscriptions. We know that they existed, we know that they were real, and he is showing some kind of legitimate historical memory there. But he puts them in his book almost always in the wrong place. So gods that we have attested for Southern Arabia, he puts with the northern tribes, right? And gods that we have attested for the northern tribes, he puts in Southern Arabia and things like that. So there's clearly some memory, but it's also some confusion, right? So it's sort of, and sometimes these things are subtle. Like we might know that Thursday comes from Thor, but do we know so much about, the Norse myths? Not so much. So things at the onomásticon research for us, we don't necessarily get the same level of accuracy for the stories.
Mhm. Excellent. Okay, I mean, I think we could be here all night, but just out of respect of everyone's time, we'll end it here. I just want to thank everyone for coming, and especially to Professor Anthony for your time and your lecture. Just want to bring to everyone's attention that our next Ptarmigan lecture will be November 16th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. We'll have Dr. Maria Doerfler from Yale University. She'll be speaking to us about women teachers in early Syriac communities. So look forward to seeing you then. Again, thank you everyone for coming out, and wish you a pleasant evening. Take care.